evolving continuously. So it's good. In this lecture, we will summarize the current efforts of the governments of Canada and the governments of British Columbia to tackle climate change. The goal of this lecture is to give us an overview of what's going on as of the last year or so, and provide some historic context for where we currently are. Because Canada's response to climate change and the contribution to the international community is a topic of much current political debate, it's constantly in flux, and things can change relatively quickly. So we'll not be able to cover the topic comprehensively, but by the end of this lecture, you should be able to explain Canada's plan for combating climate change and the current targets, understand the current debate about the federal carbon tax, describe British Columbia's approach for mitigating climate change, and understand how close Canada might be to meeting its targets. Let's begin with a brief history of Canada's involvement in international climate change initiatives. In 1992, at the Earth Summit in Rio, which we've talked about previously in the lectures on international sustainability initiatives, the world created the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now, Canada signed this convention under the Conservative government of Brian Mulroney, and it was the first G7 country to ratify the agreement. In 2002, under the Liberal government of Jean Chrétien, Canada ratified the Kyoto Protocol, which was negotiated in 1997. Under the protocol, Canada committed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 6% relative to 1990 levels by a year somewhere between 2008 and 2012. However, by 2008, the actual emissions were 24% higher than the emissions in 1990, so way off target. And so in 2011, under the Conservative government of Stephen Harper, Canada withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol. Now, as we discussed previously, at the time, the government had a strong focus on developing the oil sands in Alberta, which are a large source of greenhouse gas emissions. Peter Kent, Canada's Minister of Environment at the time, highlighted that the only way for Canada to avoid the financial penalties associated with not reaching their target was to withdraw from the UN treaty. The government promised to come up with a Made in Canada solution, but never actually delivered anything. In preparation for the COP21 meeting in Paris, the Conservative government under Stephen Harper submitted their INDCs, the Intended Nationally Determined Contributions, and they submitted these in the spring of 2015. In those INDCs for Canada, it stated that Canada would intend to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by 30% below our 2005 levels by 2030. Let's have a quick look at what this actually looked like. Okay, so this chart will get a bit complicated, so let's go through it slowly. What you see on the chart are Canada's overall greenhouse gas emissions, both historic and projected. In 2005, the new reference year, Canada's annual greenhouse gas emissions were roughly 740 megatons of CO2 equivalent. Now, a megaton is a million tons, and they're talking about CO2 equivalents because in addition to CO2, we are emitting other greenhouse gases like methane. So all those gases are lumped together and classified as CO2 equivalents. They also use CO2 equivalents because methane is anywhere from 6 to 20 times more powerful a greenhouse gas than CO2. So one methane would be equivalent to 20 CO2 equivalents. To get an overall picture of our effect on the climate, the effect of all of these CO2 gases is converted into tons of CO2. For example, a ton of emitted methane has the same effect on the climate as 28 tons of emitted CO2. Since CO2 is the most dominant greenhouse gas emitted by humans, it just makes sense to use it as the reference gas. So, emitting 1 megaton of CO2 and 1 megaton of methane in the same year would show up as 29 megatons of CO2 equivalents on this chart. Now, the emissions in 2005 were pretty much at the peak of Canada's emissions, approximately 25% above the level of 1990, the reference year for the Kyoto Protocol. As a reference, Canada's original Kyoto commitment was to be at 6% below the 1990 level, which should have us at 555 megatons of CO2 equivalent by 2012. At the same time, however, we were at about 700 megatons instead. So the proposed reduction of 30% below 2005 for the Paris Agreement is a substantial amount to reduce, but it's actually just 12% below the 1990 base year of the Kyoto Protocol. In other words, it's more ambitious, but not as much as it sounds. If we actually had done something after ratifying the Kyoto Protocol, we'd be in much better shape now. And as I hope you learned from the climate change simulation model, that you're always better to act sooner rather than waiting and acting later. Between the submission of the INDC in the spring and the actual meeting in December, we had a change of government in Canada. And it was the newly elected Liberal government of Justin Trudeau who led the Canadian delegation in Paris. During his campaign, Trudeau promised much more action on climate change than the previous government, which he could immediately prove during the Paris conference. What you see on this image is part of the Canadian delegation in Paris, which not only consisted of the federal government with the Prime Minister and a number of ministers like Catherine McKenna and the minister who was the Minister of Environment at the time. Actually, it was changed the name to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, and she's in the second role. In the middle, there's Stéphane Dion, the Minister of Finance at the time. who's right behind Catherine McKenna. But also, along with the Liberal cabinet, there were these members of the Liberal cabinet, there were opposition leaders like BC's Premier Christy Clark in the blue jacket in the front row, Rachel Notley, Alberta's Premier to the left of Christy Clark, and then some Indigenous leaders as well. On April 22nd, 2016, about half a year after the end of the negotiations in Paris, Justin Trudeau signed the Paris Agreement on behalf of Canada at the United Nations headquarters in New York. And on October 5th, 2016, the Canadian Parliament ratified Canada's participation in the Paris Agreement. As you can see from this news posting, that the vote was 207 for and 81 against, with the Liberal, NDP, and Bloc Québécois MPs backing the government's desire, while the Conservative MPs voted against ratifying the Paris Agreement. With that, winning that vote in Parliament, Canada was a committed member of the global community to fight climate change once again. Now, to get the motion passed, the Prime Minister had to outline his rough plans for how to achieve the commitments. During his speech, he stated that he would use the INDCs that were submitted by the previous government as a starting point, and that carbon pricing would play a crucial role in Canada's action plan. Now, making promises to the international community is one thing, but actually following up on them is really another. And so here's where the real work began. Because Canada is a federation, the federal government cannot implement their commitments alone. Instead, the federal government needs to work with the provinces and territories to come up with a meaningful plan to implement the Paris Agreement. The negotiations with the provinces started in March 2016, and despite not having a plan yet, the federal government still ratified the agreement by October, and this ruffled some feathers among the provincial leaders. However, on December 9th, 2016, about 1 year after the Paris meeting, Canada's first ministers announced after some hard negotiations that a pan-American or pan-Canadian framework for clean growth and climate change would be the path to address this challenge. Now, not everybody agreed, and Saskatchewan actually did not adopt the framework. Now, what is the pan-Canadian framework for clean growth and climate change? The second reading that's on Canvas for this topic provides a detailed overview of the content of the pan-Canadian framework. So we won't go into a bunch of detail here, but let's look at its main 4 pillars. First, the installation of some sort of Canada-wide carbon pricing. Second, some targeted actions for specific sectors of the economy, like transportation and power production. Third, efforts to make Canadian communities more resilient to the expected change associated with climate change, with special focus on the most vulnerable communities, and investments into technology and innovation to make Canada a world leader in green technology. In addition, Canada committed to contribute $2.65 billion to the Green Climate Fund by 2020 to help the poorest and most vulnerable countries mitigate and adapt to climate change. Now, as we said, we won't go into much detail on each of these pillars, but you can find the information about the framework on the website of Environment and Climate Change Canada. Okay, sticking with the new name. What we want to look at now, though, is a bit more time on this idea of carbon pricing, the carbon pricing component, because it's been one of the most controversial and contested parts of the framework. As I hope you can recall from our discussions on market failures, climate change is basically a massive, big negative externality of the use of fossil fuels. So using fossil fuels causes this negative externality of climate change. Because it doesn't cost anything to dump CO2 into the atmosphere, the activities that emit CO2 are too cheap, and therefore they're very widespread. So putting a price on carbon aims to more accurately represent the true environmental and social costs of the activities that burn fossil fuels. So the higher price to emit carbon into the atmosphere should incentivize people and businesses and the whole economy to use fossil fuels more efficiently and responsibly. If you make driving a car more expensive, then people think twice about driving the car for every little thing and look to alternatives like taking the bus, biking, or walking. So economists actually tell us that carbon pricing is the most cost-effective way for changing people's behavior without hurting the economy. Now, there are 2 ways of doing this. You can either add a carbon tax to all activities that burn fossil fuels, or you can install a cap and trade system where the government sets a limit on the overall emissions that the economy can have and hands out emission permits that can be traded among the emitters. In both cases, activities that emit more carbon become more expensive, providing both companies and consumers with incentives to change to lower emission alternatives. In the supplementary material for this section, I've added a few lectures that explain how the 2 systems work and why carbon pricing is economically the most efficient way to combat climate change. So this is a key point that all the specialists in the field suggest that carbon pricing, so carbon taxes, is the most efficient and economically feasible way to combat climate change. But politically, it's very, very hard to implement because we have these people waving their hands in the air just saying, oh, it's a tax. And so they just use the word tax to really turn people against it. In June 2018, the federal government operationalized their carbon pricing objective with the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act. There are 2 main parts to this act. First, The Act specifies that a minimum charge for carbon on 21 types of fuels and waste materials that are burned for producing heat or electricity. And second, the Act defines an output-based pricing system for large industrial emitters that emit more than 50,000 tons of CO2 equivalent every year. Now, the provinces and territories are free to choose whether they want to implement a carbon tax or a cap-and-trade system, as long as the provinces and territories meet the minimum pricing and emission reduction targets set out by the federal government. And it's the federal government setting these because it's the federal government that represents Canada that signed on to the United Nations Paris Agreement. Now, if the provinces and territories don't meet the minimum criteria or don't implement a carbon pricing system at all, the Act says that the federal government can implement their carbon pricing system in the province. And this is what's referred to as a federal backstop. Under that system, the price of carbon pollution was set at $20 per ton in 2019 as a starting point, and increasing by $10 per ton every year until it is $50 per ton in 2022. Now, a key part of the Canadian carbon tax is that provinces and territories had time to implement their own system, but not all of them did by the deadline. So in April of 2019, the federal backstop carbon tax was applied to Ontario, New Brunswick, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. And in July 2019, the same rules were applied to Nunavut and the Yukon. So all of the provinces and territories had a carbon pricing system in place that satisfied the federal requirements. British Columbia, for example, had already implemented a carbon tax in 2008, and Quebec implemented a cap-and-trade system in 2013. It wasn't until January 2020 that Alberta also fell under the federal carbon tax because the new Conservative government there under Jason Kenney repealed the provincial carbon tax that was put in place in 2015 by the NDP provincial government under Rachel Notley. Not all the provinces were happy with the backstop plan, and some of them, including Ontario, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, started legal challenges against the federal government. The big question is whether the federal government actually has the legal right to impose this tax on provinces and territories, or whether doing so is unconstitutional. As we discussed in our lecture on institutions, the Canadian Constitution specifies the rules of how Canadians govern themselves and how different levels of government interact with each other. So the debate is whether the federal carbon tax is playing according to these rules or not. At least on the surface, it seems to be a battle about priorities and values. It doesn't seem to a complete accident that all of the provinces that have launched legal challenges currently have Conservative governments. Now, there have been several court rulings. Both Ontario and Saskatchewan courts of appeal have decided that the federal carbon tax is constitutional. The Alberta Court of Appeal, on the other hand, stated that the federal law encroaches on the power of the provinces over natural resources, which provinces have jurisdiction over natural resources in the Canadian Constitution. The debate finally reached the Supreme Court of Canada in September 2020. The court was asked to rule on the constitutionality of the federal government imposing a federal carbon tax on provinces that did not want to use a carbon tax or a cap-and-trade system. In March 2021, the Supreme Court ruled that the federal carbon tax is constitutional, and the federal government can impose a carbon tax on provinces that did not act because the threat of climate change transcends provincial boundaries, and climate change is a matter of national concern. So this was the ruling of the Supreme Court, that climate change is a matter of national concern. Therefore, the federal government can act to impose a carbon tax across all provinces. If you're interested in listening to the arguments from the Supreme Court, you can actually watch the entire proceedings on a website that they have for the Supreme Court. There's a link to the website in the Canvas page below these lectures. One of the main criticisms with the approach of the current government is that they stayed with the emissions target that the previous government submitted to the Paris Conference as their INDC, and that was 30% below 2005 with a target for 2030. As of 2020, the latest developments in the government's plan to combat climate change was a tabling on Bill C-12, the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act, which aims to enshrine the government's commitment to net zero emissions by 2050. Net zero means that there would be no new emissions released into the atmosphere on an annual basis. As discussed in previous lecture, this means bringing down the annual emissions to a level where the emissions can be removed again from the atmosphere by natural processes and any technical carbon capture storage efforts that materialize for that particular year. This means that we would not add any new carbon emissions again into the atmosphere. This is an ambitious goal, which the government first announced in their throne speech in December of 2019. But the novelty of the proposed act is that it would create an accountability framework for reaching this target. This is a substantial step in the right direction, as the climate action of the Canadian government has been plagued historically with setting targets and then just not reaching them. The new act proposes to have milestones every 5 years, where the government has to report on its achievements since the last milestone, and then set targets and plan for the next 5 years. The act also proposes that the progress would be audited by an independent body. While this bill is certainly a step in the right direction, there is still considerably more to do, and there are still criticisms from all sides. The first milestone is set for 2030, which seems too far in the future for keeping this government accountable. There also are no explicit penalties for not reaching the targets, and there's nothing stopping future governments from repealing the law again. In addition, the provinces are not tied into the accountability framework. And if the current debate around carbon taxes is any indication about the province's willingness to be included, then it's going to be a tough slog. At this point, the bill has simply been tabled and is up for debate in Parliament. And because we currently have a minority government, the minority Liberal government will need the support of at least one opposition party like the NDP, the Green Party, and the Bloc Québécois to get this through. Let's turn now to look at British Columbia and the efforts to curb the emissions of greenhouse gases there. BC has actually been quite progressive. In 2008, the Liberal government under Gordon Campbell implemented a revenue-neutral carbon tax in BC, which became the first jurisdiction in North America to have such a tax. It was initially set at $10 per ton, which resulted in about 2.41 cents per liter of gas. The tax increased $5 per ton every year until it reached $30 per ton in 2012. The tax is currently at $40 per ton. As a result of the tax, the fuel consumption in BC fell 17% over the first 5 years when the tax was in place, while consumption in Canada went up by about 1.5%. At the same time, BC's GDP, the gross domestic product, kept pace with the rest of Canada. As a result, BC's carbon tax became a showcase example for the effectiveness of the carbon tax approach. BC has a number of other climate change mitigation legislations, like our Clean Energy Act from 2010, which ensures that our electrical power is generated in a clean way. The updated Climate Change Accountability Act from November 2018, which sets the current emission targets and specifies the reporting requirements for the province. And the Zero Emissions Vehicle Act from 2019, which specifies what percentage of new car sales need to be zero-emission vehicles. Note that by 2040, all new cars need to be zero-emission vehicles in British Columbia. All of this legislation combined together under the Clean BC strategy, which was first presented in 2018. If you're interested in this, you can find out more information at cleanbc.gov.bc.ca. Now, having a plan is a good start, but following up and properly implementing it is where it's a real challenge. As we already discussed, the currently tabled Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act is trying to create this accountability. In 2018, the Auditor General of Canada, in collaboration with the Auditors Generals of all the provinces and territories, conducted an independent review of Canada's efforts to combat climate change to get a sense of where we were at. The report was presented to the House of Commons in the spring of 2018, and it highlighted that the Canadian government is working on climate change, but the work is far, far from being done. At the time, more than half of the governments in Canada, provincial and territorial governments, did not have targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And of those that did, only two of them were on track to meet their targets, New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. In other words, the report did not think that BC would be reaching its 2020 goal of reducing emissions by 33% relative to 2007. The report also highlighted that substantial additional efforts are required for reaching Canada's emissions reduction target by 2030. So, despite having more climate-friendly government, we're still not on the right path for reaching the 30% below 2005 levels before 2030. This was the target of our INDC that we presented to the Paris Agreement. Now, as we've discussed in previous lectures, mitigating climate change is only one part of the equation. Because climate change is already happening, we are expecting more and having to plan for how to adapt to the expected change. And this will be critical for protecting the welfare of Canadians. Here, the review that was done states that many governments don't have a plan, or their plans lack detail for effective implementation. So unfortunately, overall, Canada is not looking great. We're talking about climate change, but our actions are not getting us where we need to be. If you're interested in learning more about where Canada stands, you can find the reports, well, for both Canada as a whole and British Columbia at the URL shown on this slide. I've also included links to these reports in the supplementary material on the Canvas page for the topic. In addition to independent but internal reviews of Canada's climate action, there are also a number of international not-for-profits organizations that keep track of countries' efforts to combat climate change. One of these not-for-profits is the Climate Action Tracker. The website is run by a consortium of climate science and policy institutes, mainly based out of Germany. Their objective is to provide an independent scientific analysis that tracks government's climate action and measures it against the globally agreed targets as defined in the Paris Agreement. What you see on this graphic is their current assessment of the global situation. They say that pledges and targets that were submitted to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change would get us to plus 2.6 degrees Celsius. But the current policies that are actually in place will likely only get us to plus 2.9 degrees Celsius. The more optimistic targets, however, which include the recent announcements by China, the 2050 net zero emission targets by President Biden and Canada, would be able to get us very close to the 2-degree goal of the Paris Agreement. So there is hope, but obviously we need to follow through. The Climate Action Tracker also assesses the actions of individual countries, and Canada is one of the countries that they monitor. Their assessment of Canada clearly states that while we have some decent plans, there has been little done on the actual implementation side. They therefore rate Canada's actions as insufficient. If all countries acted like Canada, they expected that the global warming would end up between +2 and +3 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. Now, compared to other countries that are being monitored by the Climate Action Tracker, we are not the worst, but it's still not sufficient. So we need to do a lot better if we want to be part of the solution for reaching the Paris target. Now, I know that this was a lot of details about the Canadian efforts to combat climate change. Most of this was intended to give you a general sense of what's going on in Canada, but I definitely don't expect you to remember all these details for the exam. There are some main points, though, that I want everybody to take away from this particular lecture. I want you to know that Canada's part of the Paris, that we've signed on to the Paris Agreement, and the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change outlines the general approach that Canada is taking in collaboration with the provinces and territories. You should also know that Canada's currently stated goal for climate change mitigation is to reach net zero emissions by 2050. A key pillar of the Canadian approach is to put a price on carbon, either with a carbon tax or a cap and trade system. Provinces are free to choose which approach they want to take, but they have to implement one that fulfills the federal requirements. And if they don't, the federal carbon tax kicks in inside that province or territory. This is generally referred to as the federal backstop. Economists tell us that carbon pricing is the most effective way to promote change, but some of the provincial governments are currently fighting the federal government on whether the federal carbon tax is constitutional or not. A decision from the Supreme Court is expected sometime in 2021. BC has had a carbon tax since 2008, and it has had the desired effect without negatively affecting the local economy. Now, making commitments is a great start, but to be meaningful and actually making a difference, it's necessary to follow up on these commitments and implement these commitments properly. To make sure things are happening, it's key that there's some mechanism for accountability. Canada has a bit of a history of setting targets and then not reaching them, and this is what the latest national and international reviews of our current efforts are warning us about. As well, we are currently not on path for meeting our targets, and we need to do much better if we're really going to make a difference. This does not only apply to the mitigation of climate change, but also to our efforts for adaptation to adapt to the expected changes of climate change. So these are the main points that I want you to take away from this lecture. But remember, the efforts and policies of the governments for dealing with climate change are evolving continuously. So it's good to stay up to date and follow the news. What I've presented here is just an intended starting point for getting into the topic. If you want to explore some of these topics in more detail, there are some links and supplementary material on Canvas. So that'll be the end of this lecture, and I thank you for listening to this point. We'll talk to you again soon. Bye for now.